The Mexican-American War. It is the year of 1830. Even though Mexico got its independence some years earlier in 1821 from Spain, after a revolution and an armed conflict which lasted over a decade, the country was in total chaos. Looking at the map of that time, we can see a larger Mexico than the one we know today, a stretched country, one of the biggest at that time. The newly independent nation was in dire straits after 11 years of war. No plans or guidelines were established by the revolutionaries, so internal struggles for control of a government ensued. Mexico suffered a complete lack of funds to organize a country of around 4.5 million square kilometers. At that time, Mexico faced the threats of emerging internal rebellions and of invasion by Spanish forces from their base in nearby Cuba. This government was characterized by instability, and it was ill-prepared for international conflict when war with the Americans broke out only 2 decades later in 1846. The United States was in expansion, and the country was much bigger than it was when it became independent. The United States of America expanded deeper into the Native American territories, and they purchased the huge Louisiana territory from the French. Although the country was expanding, there was an opportunity for more. Due to Mexico's internal problems, several regions rebelled and tried to break away. Texas gained its independence from Mexico in 1836. Initially, the United States declined to incorporate it into the Union, largely because northern political interests were against the addition of a new slave state. The Mexican government was also encouraging border raids and warning that any attempt at annexation would lead to war, since the Mexicans still considered Texas as part of their land. Nonetheless, annexation procedures were quickly initiated after the 1844 election of Polk, who campaigned that Texas should be re-annexed and that the Oregon Territory should be reoccupied. Polk also had his eyes on California, New Mexico, and the rest of what is today the U.S. Southwest. Looking to expand, Polk offered to purchase those lands, but the offer was rejected, and soon after, he instigated conflict by moving troops into a disputed zone between the Rio Grande and Nueces River that both countries had previously recognized as part of the Mexican state of Coahuila. The tension grew more and more over the disputed lands. Texas was annexed by the United States on December 29, 1845, and became the 28th state. However, the United States inherited the southern and western border dispute with Mexico, which had refused to recognize Texas's independence or the U.S.'s offers to purchase the territory. Thus, through this act, the tensions between the two countries transformed into a war. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a group of U.S. soldiers in the disputed zone under the command of General Zachary Taylor, killing about a dozen. They then laid siege to an American fort along the Rio Grande. Taylor called in reinforcements and was able to defeat the Mexicans at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Following those battles, Polk told the U.S. Congress that the cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before Mexico passed the boundary of the United States, invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. On May 13th, Congress declared war, while no official declaration of war ever came from Mexico. In terms of how the war began, the situation is debatable. We have an ill-prepared Mexico with internal revolts and an emerging power that looks to expand more and more. Mexico was weaker, but the U.S. did not want to look like a bully. Even so, Ulysses S. Grant, who had opposed the war but served as an Army lieutenant in Taylor's army, claims in his personal memoirs that the main goal of the U.S. Army's advance from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande was to provoke the outbreak of war without attacking first, to debilitate any political opposition to the war. After Mexican independence, there was a man, Antonio López de Santa Anna, a controversial character who, in the first place, didn't support Mexican independence from Spain, but then fought in support of it. Then he backed the monarchy of the Mexican Empire, then revolted against the emperor, and then supported a republic. The country tried to find its path, and these shocks led to more trouble and weakness over time. Santa Anna served 12 non-consecutive presidential terms over a period of 22 years. After the U.S. declared war on Mexico in 1846, an internal coalition, including forced-out President Mariano Paredes, sought a return to a federal republic with Santa Anna as the president. He wrote a letter to Mexico City stating he did not care to return to the presidency, but would like to come out of exile in Cuba to use his military experience to reclaim Texas for Mexico. President Valentin Gómez Farías, driven to desperation, accepted the offer and allowed Santa Anna. What was unknown for the courage President Farías is that Santa Anna has been secretly dealing with U.S. representatives to sell all contested territory to the U.S. at a reasonable price, on the condition that he be allowed back in Mexico through the U.S. naval blockades. And so Santa Anna returned to Mexico, taking his place at the head of the army. Once in this powerful position, he went back on his word, declaring himself president and prepared to fight off the U.S. forces' invasion. The Americans achieved 2 victories at the Battle of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. General Stephen Watts Kearny and his troops started to advance in the disputed territory and in New Mexico. The American troops encountered no Mexican forces when they arrived on August 15th. They entered Santa Fe and claimed the New Mexico territory for the United States without a single shot being fired. Kearny declared himself the military governor of the new territory on August 18th, and he established a civil government. A temporary legal system was created, now known today as the Kearny Code. Kearny set out for California on September 25th. In December of 1846, after the successful conquest of New Mexico, parts of Kearny's Army of the West moved into modern-day northwest Mexico. They were led by Alexander Donovan, continuing what ended up being a year-long 5,500-mile campaign. But in the territory, a rebellion happened, known as the Taos Revolt. There were multiple separate skirmishes, but the U.S. military moved quickly to subdue the revolt. Meanwhile, the commander of the Navy's Pacific Squadron, John D. Sloat, had received orders to seize San Francisco Bay and blockade California ports. Captain John C. Fremont, leading a U.S. topographical expedition to survey the Great Basin, entered the Sacramento Valley in December 1845. Fremont's party was at Upper Klamath Lake, Oregon Territory, when it received word that war between Mexico and the United States was imminent. The party then returned to California. On Sloat's orders, Fremont brought 160 volunteers to Monterey, in addition to the California Battalion. On July 15th, Sloat transferred his command of the Pacific Squadron to Commodore Robert Stockton, who was more militarily aggressive. General Castro and Governor Pio Pico wrote farewells and fled separately to the Mexican state of Sonora. Stockton's army entered Los Angeles unopposed on August 13th. At that point, he sent a report to the Secretary of State that California is entirely free from Mexican dominion. Meanwhile, U.S. Colonel Stephen W. Kearny had performed a march across New Mexico and the Sonoran Desert and crossed the Colorado River in late November 1846. On December 7th, 100 Lancers under General Andres Pico, brother of the governor, fought the U.S. Army of about 150 at the Battle of San Pascual. The wounded Kearny pushed on until he had to establish a defensive position on a hill. General Pico kept the hill under siege until a 215-man American relief force arrived. A 600-man American force under Kearny began a 150-mile march to Los Angeles. On January 8, 1846, the Stockton-Kearny Army defeated the Mexican force in the 2-hour Battle of Rio San Gabriel. The Treaty of Cahuenga was signed, which marked the end of armed resistance in California. The conflict continued elsewhere. The Mexican army's defeats at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma caused even more political turmoil in Mexico. Led by General Zachary Taylor, 2,300 U.S. troops crossed the Rio Grande and proceeded south. The hard-fought Battle of Monterey resulted in serious losses on both sides. The Mexican forces were under General Pedro Ampudia, and they repulsed Taylor's best infantry. American soldiers were not familiar with urban warfare. They marched straight down the open streets and were caught by surprise by well-hidden Mexican defenders. Even though the Mexicans repulsed the Americans, General Taylor created an 8-week armistice with the Mexican army, allowing them to evacuate and return for the surrender of the city. Under pressure from Washington, Taylor broke the armistice and occupied the city of Saltillo. On February 22, Santa Anna personally marched north to fight General Taylor with 20,000 men. The 4,600 Americans had entrenched at a mountain pass called Buena Vista. The Mexicans suffered desertions on the way north and arrived with 15,000 men in a tired state. Knowing his numbers were still superior, he demanded the surrender of the U.S. Army, but was refused. Thus, he attacked the next morning. Santa Anna flanked the U.S. position